Okay, and it looks like we're live. Welcome, Brandon. Thanks for coming on.
Sure. Thanks for having me, Finn.
Oh, of course, of course. You are the editor at WhoWhatWhy. Um,
One of the in the complicated hierarchy of editorial structure at Who What Why or anywhere, I'm a senior editor, which
oh,
I don't
very
know.
nice.
I don't know what that means. It means I've been around for longer than an associate editor, but even that's up in the air. Yeah,
How long have you been at WhoWhatWhy?
exactly a year, which I found out because all of a sudden I started getting all of these notes on LinkedIn, which like nobody ever connects me on LinkedIn, and they were all like, "Congratulations on your anniversary." I was like, what the hell is everybody talking about?" And then I had to go and look, and it's like, oh, everybody gets prompted when you're at your year anniversary for whatever thing. So that's how I knew. Apparently, it was just a year.
Yeah, that's pretty impressive. You liking it? Pretty good work to do.
Yeah, it's great. I have had not a terribly unorthodox career as a journalist, but I have certainly been in places where the alternative, where the end was going to come at some point. So I could never say, well, the New York Times isn't going anywhere because I was never at the New York Times. I was always at smaller pubs. So the idea that like there was going to be some sea change and we might as well start thinking about what that is kind of has been with me my whole career. And so when I connected with Russ at Who What Why, I liked that mission. I was like, okay, it's a nonprofit, it's volunteer driven, they're trying to fundraise. The shape of the coverage is still very much a work in progress, and all that stuff just sort of appealed to me. Like, well, let's get in there. Let's treat this thing like a laboratory and see what we can do and see what people respond to, and sort of make all of those mistakes because there's a lot of forgiveness for that because there's a lot of startups now. A lot of nonprofits. I mean, as much as the narrative is like journalism is dying, it's really like, well, a lot of the legacy stuff is. And then everybody's trying this new stuff, super hyper local things, very like topic specific stuff. You're just kind of seeing this um, uh, sort of refinement of like, well, we can write about anything. And then of course like Substack and all that too.
Yeah, that's been taken off a lot lately. People just publishing their own sort of stuff, which is brilliant. Brilliant way to do it. And Russ too. Like when I first contacted him, I was surprised by how friendly and open he was. Like I thought I was going to get someone in charge that's too busy to talk to anyone, but he was real friendly to me and like just he came on here as well and had a chat, and that was awesome.
Yeah.
So having him as your boss would be pretty legendary.
It's funny. I was in New York yesterday. So we met in person for the first time over the weekend. And which none of us had really met. So it was fun to sit down with him, and we were talking about like he knows these people and these people, and I was like, you know a lot of people. I mean, I know people, but it seems like you know a lot of people. And he's like, well, I think it's because I'm nice. I was like, that's true. There are a lot of misanthropes in journalism, so you're kind of a freak if you're, you know, just approachable, friendly, decent human being. It's
It's
rare.
surprising how far that goes. Yeah, it is. Because of how rare it is, I think it really latches onto people. Like, yeah, it was. I was so surprised. I was so taken back by it. I genuinely thought, some big time guy who would have no time for me. Plus, the amount of books he's written and writing is just ridiculous.
Well, I think that's one thing is that he and I share, and part of the organization's mandate is to look for that talent, to look for people who are interested in things, and not as much like, have you been to J school, have you done 15 years of working for these things, because again, like that's journalism is a skill set, and it's something that you can apply to a number of things, and you can teach it to somebody without having to send them to undergrad or grad school. And sorry to tell that to people who are looking to spend a lot of money for grad school. Like maybe you don't need to, just sort of figure out what the thing is. And so like when somebody reaches out to them and they have drive and interest and they're doing something cool, it's like, well, let's see where this goes. Let's figure it out.
Where were you? Where were you working before here? Before here?
Before Who What Why, I've been freelance for about 5 years doing stuff. I'm in Los Angeles, and I was doing stuff for Los Angeles Magazine and San Francisco Magazine and a startup pub called an actual print quarterly, or is it bi-monthly? It's not monthly, but anyway, it's a big glossy thing called the Journal of Alta California, which is obviously the state of California. So a lot of these regional things. Oh, and then about a year and a half ago, I started doing radio for the first time in my career. I'd never done radio before. It was always print, long form, newspaper, magazine stuff.
Definitely got the voice for it.
Well, thank you very much. This equipment really helps. And then I get off this, and I'm just like Gilbert Godfrey the rest of the time. So it was just doing a lot of freelance stuff. And then before that, I was the editor of an alt weekly in San Francisco called SF Weekly, which well, you read that article. Like they closed it possibly forever. It seems like it's probably gone. But that happened the same week. Yeah, it was like within a week or even a day. I have to go back and look, but it was within a couple of days of the first alt weekly I worked at in Richmond, Virginia, called Style Weekly. That had folded. So both of the papers that I really considered like the bookend of my journalism career at that point, both like packed up like the same time. And they're both they're both almost 40. It was like that was as far as it was going to be taken. One was bought by the parent company was bought by a hedge fund that is notorious for shutting down papers, and the other one, the one in that's Style in Richmond, and then in San Francisco, that one's owned by a local real estate magnate, and his motivations are somewhat mysterious. What's he going to do with it? We don't know yet.
Do you know what that company's called that buys them up and shuts them down?
Yeah, it's called Alden Capital. They're huge. I mean, they're an extremely wealthy, and so they bought up like the Tribune, and they're buying up these big mega companies, the ones that own a lot of newspapers already. And then their kind of idea is to, depending on how you think about it, there's two interesting schools of thought. One is the critical thought is they go in and they kind of sell it for scrap, right? Like they lay off a bunch of people, they figure out what's the cheapest they can run it. Or they really do. They're like, well, we'll sell this building for the real estate value. We'll do this. And so they close down papers. The valid other point to that is like some of the papers they bought would have closed sooner because they were on the verge of bankruptcy. They did not have any money. So, there's this very uncomfortable position that you have when you are dealing with a hedge fund like this, the goal of which is, that's their business. Like they want to make money however they can off of what you can consider the raw material of these established legacy journalism outlets. And, if it looked like they were going to survive and be profitable, then they would probably continue that. But really the profit goal seems to be, run them as leanly as possible and then just sort of ride it out. I mean, I think that's the whole thing. Is we're sort of like, for a long time, I think it's felt like we were in a machine in the sky and the engine's cut out, and so now we're sort of just gliding and the landing is unclear. Like, is it going to be kind of like a touchdown and we transition to something else? Or are we just going nose first into the sand,
This Alden Capital, does it keep ones going or is it shutting all of them down?
Both. I mean, it'll take an outlet, and some of the littler ones, if there's not, it'll sort of like track the trajectory of it. You can always say, well, they have all this money, which is true, billions of dollars. I can't even remember what their valuation is, but they're hugely wealthy. And you could take a small town paper and reinvigorate it for very cheap. But there's no profit to that. They're watching the trajectory of it, like with most legacy media, go down. So, the idea that that they would reinvest or that they're going to revolutionize that market, that doesn't seem like that's what's going on here. It seems like they exist in a place and time where journalism offers, journalism companies offer a certain way to make money. But for this company, their strategy seems to be, running everything as leanly as possible. The stuff that just doesn't seem like it's going to turn it around or like become a valuable product, they're going to strip that stuff down. And then the bigger ones, I guess that becomes the question of, if you have a big publication, like a big city daily, for example, you're going to probably stop printing because that's an extreme cost, and then go online. And then if you go online, there's all these questions of like, well, how do you market that? And the idea that Washington Post and New York Times, Fox News, MSNBC, these big outlets did really well during the Trump era because everybody had something to talk about. It was great, and subscriptions were great. But those are very, very unique models. Like the New York Times, I think most of their revenue base, or at least a significant part of it, comes from subscriptions, which is just unheard of in 2021.
Yeah. Do you think that's a bad business model to base it all off Trump as well? Because then you're going to fail as soon as he gets out. So you can't really keep that continuing. I was going to ask, like, do you think? Well, you must think it, but the paper ones, are they just people are buying less and less papers these days and just moving onto online? Is there anywhere
Yeah.
where paper is going up in sales, or is it just it's dead?
No, I don't think. I think for magazines, that arc is going down a little bit slower. I mean, I think, yeah, mostly people read stuff on their phones or on their computers. Less on their computers, more on their phones. I mean, mobile is the direction everybody's going. And so, yeah, I think there just aren't that many people that are reading newspapers. And even for like the New York Times, it might be like you subscribe and you get the Sunday because there's these artifacts in there that you can like go through and read, like the crossword puzzle or the New York Times Magazine or whatever, and somebody wants to like have their coffee. And that whole, I think the ritual of newspaper reading is something that is really particular to a generation that is getting older. And I think young people, I remember seeing this YouTube video, you've probably seen it, of, and you've also probably been around children, so but it was a YouTube video of a baby who was trying to yeah, like a baby ass baby. I don't know, some months old. Anyway, was like pinching and manipulating the pages of a magazine as though it was an iPad, right? And the whole idea was like, this kid doesn't know what non-digital, non-interactive media is, but this is the relationship they have. So, you have a generation that's coming up on that. And that's the rituals that they're accustomed to. So, for somebody like that, for somebody who's 5 or 6 or 18 or 19, like, what does it mean to stand outside and pick up a newspaper and come inside and read it when like none of the patterns of your day are around that? So, I think at some point we were actually talking about this as a story idea for a media column for Who, What, Why, to do the like the first line of stories that we know will happen. So like at some point the New York Times is going to stop printing paper. Like I think it's pretty inevitable. So like what does that look like? We all know it's happening, so why not just write it now and then see if we can get how close we could get to the date, of what it was and like what the circumstances were. And then for magazines, I think they'll have a little more longevity, in part because it's cheaper to produce a thing once a month. And I don't know, I think they just sort of are more fun to read, more fun to look at for a broader, a broader generation. Or there will be a throwback effect, like with vinyl, like you know, people are wearing 90s era flannels and they're like, I really want to pick up a Wednesday edition of, the Cleveland Plains Dealer and read that. Won't that be a kick? I don't know.
It might also reach a point as well where the news online, especially news like Facebook and that, just gets so tailored that you can't get outside sources. So people might try and exit that and go back to the old school to try and get their independence back in what they're reading as well. I
Yeah.
don't. It would have to get pretty bad for that to happen, but definitely a possibility.
Well, I could see a version of. There would have to be a couple of things would happen. One, you have a generation of young people that moves inland. This is in the United States, but I think it would be a trend that would apply elsewhere. Well, it would be young people moving away from big urban cores for whatever reason. Climate change, cities are too crappy, cost of living's too high, you're going to go somewhere. So you have these communities that are established perhaps in post-industrial areas like Detroit, where like there are, farms in the middle of the city now, and they sell property for nothing. Although even that now is becoming more expensive. But anyway, you build this community, right, from the ground up, and the community is, a dozen people or 100 people or whatever, and it occupies a few city blocks. Then you might find that there's some kind of really interesting model there where somebody's like, I could print fairly cheaply almost like a newsletter that is just for this hyper local community of people, and that serves a real value where it's like, I don't know, like somebody's a farmer and you list the prices of their products so that everybody who hasn't been around the farmer in a day or two knows how much apples are or whatever it is. I mean, obviously there's a kind of weird regressive quality to that, but I mean, I think that would be possible, and I think it'd be pretty neat to see like zines emerge from these communities, that kind of thing,
Yeah, more localization happening. Yeah, I could see that as well. There was because here here in Queensland where I live in Australia, um, every single paper, 100% of the papers here are all owned by Rupert Murdoch. He owns literally every one of them. And when I was calling through and kind of doing a little investigation at the beginning of last year, um, I was calling people in New South Wales as well and chatting to their owners of the newspapers and seeing how they kind of thought what that would be. And almost everyone I was talking to, like 9 out of 10 people, had been bought out by Rupert. So he's already taken over down there. And the ones that I did talk to that weren't, they very much had this idea that local is the only way forward, and that the only reason there's a few of them that were running it a negative because they think in the long run it's going to turn back because of how polarized it's going to become with Rupert just putting out his message, and that they will then take the market back because they're the only ones that are still local and still reporting on what's happening down the street or what's going on at the farm or that kind of stuff. And it was interesting. It was an interesting thought, but I would like to think that that would be the case, but I genuinely don't know because it seems like once money gets involved, it's very hard for that mentality. Like how long can you run it in negative? You can't keep doing that. Like I wish
yeah.
them all the best. I really hope they do succeed, but I don't know. I don't know if that's a long term goal, and I don't know if people actually will go back to the papers. It's
How big are these papers? Are they like
uh,
city papers, or are they smaller?
like town
Yeah.
papers, so not
Mm-hmm.
quite so big, but yeah, town size, and Australian towns too. So probably much more than the state. Our entire population is 25 million of the whole
Right.
country, so yeah, very very small. Um, the ones in Queensland, it's pretty much every town scattered across Queensland is I don't know, maybe 30,000 40,000 people each town, and I don't know, a couple of 100,000 towns. I don't know. There'd be quite a few, but you've got your major cities. So Cairns, Townsville, maybe Bundaberg, and Brisbane. That's your four major cities in Queensland, and those ones are that's you're not getting any local in those four places. But I think Brisbane here we got 4 million, so it does vary. Depends where you go. A lot of the places are outback as well, so their populations are even smaller. There's a lot of towns out there with like less than 10,000 people in the towns. So yeah.
And do you think how are they exchanging information? Because if there's not like a local paper out there, but you need to know stuff. So I mean, if they have internet, right? Is
The
there a
old
next door? Is there an outback next door?
Yeah, yeah. There's like the older guys. They will meet up at the pub, and that's where they'll get all their stories from. That is the majority of where the stories share.
Yeah,
The younger ones, they're moving to Facebook, so they're sharing all their stuff on their little groups in Facebook. Um,
yeah.
that's pretty much your only two options, really. Um, it's There's this weird effect going on where people still buy the paper, knowing full well it's owned by Rupert, and they know that it's biased, and they still buy it and still read it, even though they're aware that the majority of it's bullshit. It's a very strange concept that I don't fully understand why it's happening. So a lot of these people, like a lot of the farmers, well, I wouldn't say a lot. There's a portion of the farmers that buy the papers, and then we'll talk about it at the pub, and then the rest of the guys at the pub will just call bullshit on it because well, it is bullshit. But then you'll still get those same farmers again the next time bringing it up again. So there's a weird intersection happening where the papers are still being sold, even though everyone knows that the papers are bullshit. So it, it's weird. It's a very weird time to kind of be witnessing what's going on.
It's like muscle memory. Like I don't know. I bought it today because I bought it yesterday.
Yeah,
So
yeah. And
it's
I've been
habit.
buying for the past 40 years, so
Yeah,
gonna keep doing it.
yeah.
Um,
But I think in the United States we are, and globally, but certainly the U.S. going through kind of a political upheaval and these questions of, I mean, I think that there's a fear that that somehow there's an impossibility of crossing political lines, and that people just don't care anymore, whatever, about name a topic, race, vaccines, infrastructure, abortion, no matter what, there's all these opinions. And I think there's a fear in the media, certainly, and I think probably generally, that we're all like too far gone, and um and so you're never going to have nonpartisan media again because it's just so powerful. And I think, when you look at like MSNBC and Fox, which are very left leaning and very right leaning respectively, and how well they did in the polarized environment of the Trump era, you can say, well, of course they're going to do that, because now you have your audience, and you're just sort of, it's just confirmation bias. You're telling them what they're expecting to hear and what they want to hear. And so they'll keep coming back. And that's, it's sort of like therapy, but it's even less useful because you're not actually necessarily learning anything new. And also it's just echo chamber in the sense that like MSNBC doesn't really do any reporting. Fox doesn't really do any reporting. It's all, it's the illusion of it. But I think, I think it underneath all that, people really do want to know what's actually going on and what's really important. They've just been convinced that, and obviously there are people who don't care and like can't be convinced. And for them, I think your politics is a religion, and so you're gonna go with it regardless. But I do think, you're talking about these guys at the pub, and I think that to me is interesting, because what are you doing? You're talking about the world. Like that's the DNA of journalism is in there. What did you hear when you were out today? Well, and then you come and you bring it to this place and we share that stuff. I mean, there's this sort of fundamental thing that even if all the papers, if all the artifacts of journalism go away, there's still journalism happening, because it's, it's what we call this practice of finding out information about the world and then sharing it. Once upon a time, somebody was a minstrel and they were wandering around and they just did songs about them. And I think that's really exciting too. Like, part of the reason that I am interested in what comes next is because it's going to take some weird form. It could be as strange as somebody going town to town, like singing the news. I mean, who knows? There's all of these things. How do you make that work? Well, all it takes is a financial model. I mean, like, who would have thought 5 years ago, who would have thought that there's a huge market for people writing newsletters? You'd think, I don't want any more shit in my inbox. Why am I going to get a newsletter from a zillion people every day or week or whatever? But sure enough, it's big business. Not for, a lot of people, but for a lot. I mean, for, not for millions of journalists worldwide or whatever, but for, a lot of people. I don't know if is it the same in Australia? I mean, do you have like your newsletter celebs?
Um, Australian media is very strange, and I was listening to an ex-Australian Prime Minister talk about this just last week, actually, and he's made this point, which is 100% true, that Australians, for whatever reason, we don't really read news about other Australians. We read news about what's going on in America. So the majority of Australians here, if you were to ask them about what's going on nationally, they're going to have like a faint idea, a faint clue. But if you ask about what's going on in the States, it's like they've read every single article that's ever come out about what's happening. So, and I don't know why that is. I could not tell you why that is. But you're not really seeing too many local stories here. We've got a few that are kind of taking off in the younger generations, but the majority of those are on YouTube. So we've got one journalist named Friendly Geordies here. He has a massive YouTube following. Pretty much every young person in Australia knows what's going on here because of him, and he's the only one talking about actually what's going on here, which is again very strange. But he's built a massive audience because people are hungry for that, and they're not getting it literally anywhere else. He's literally the only one that's doing it, which is we talk about that for hours and hours and hours. A good example of that, actually, a lot of the farmers in New South Wales, they rely on water from the Murray-Darling, which is basically a massive river, which it supplies the water for the whole state essentially, 80% or something like that. And it's been these Chinese investment companies came in and they started building all these dams, and then the dams would bottle the water and then export it back to China. And all of these dams, it's messed up on so many levels, but all these dams are now cutting off the supply to go down to the farmers. So So this massive river, which flows relentlessly every fucking year, is now dammed up and isn't flowing at all. So now all these farmers aren't able to grow their crops. Their yields are going down. They're building up more and more and more debt. And there is no papers, zero papers, literally. This is not an exaggeration. Zero papers reporting on it, except for Friendly Geordies, who's actually gone down there and interviewed the farmers and talked to the farmers and got their stories and is putting it out. He is the only person and his show is a comedy show as well. So he's not even going out there as a news guy, but he's the only one doing it. And yeah, it's weird because you would think that would be a massive story here, and it very well should be. But the farmers aren't able to get out because they can't go down to their local paper and talk about it because the paper's owned by Rupert Murdoch, and for whatever reasons, he's got deals with the Chinese to not talk about it. So these stories just don't get out there.
That's a great story. And it also, of course, raises the question. I mean, you may have seen these stats. I think there's been a number of outlets, universities that have researched this. But the idea that when you have local journalism, you see these, like if you have a local paper, you're going to have measurably lower, taxation rates, corruption, all of these metrics for, a good civic life. They can measure that. And when that goes away, nobody's covering city council meetings anymore, in a small town. Nobody's seeing what businesses are doing what. So you have that exact thing happen. Because to my mind, it's like, well, who made the deals with the Chinese? And why was no one freaking out about that? Well, so, I mean, you still can ask that question, who benefits from that? And why they do it? Because some Politico did that. And was it because of kickbacks on the one hand, or are they getting some kind of actual investment from these? And I mean, it's not like, you said, well, that's farmers in Australia, but I mean, the coasts of the United States, massive, massive amounts of investment in real estate from the Chinese, from the Saudis. A lot of the luxury condo developments in places like Atlanta, Georgia. That's all Saudi money and German money, interestingly, because they, there's just bottomless resources that and then here on the West Coast, a lot of Chinese investment from Southern California all the way up to Vancouver. It's up in Canada too, BC. So, so the other side of that is like, there's also stuff that's so big that people kind of know about it, but it's like, well, I don't know what to do with that information. Like the Chinese own these 3 high rises in San Francisco. Well, and usually it doesn't. It's like, well, I don't know, it's just some sort of investment. It's a good place to park capital. But when you have something like that, where they're taking your water away from you, which, as everybody knows, that's going to be the valuable resource in the future. You're already a bit of an arid country. I don't want to be too presumptuous to say that, but I feel like you probably need all the water you can get. But yeah, that's crazy. But also, look at how, again, to go back to the idea that it's just a skill set. Like it's one dude with a YouTube channel who found these things out. Like getting in on the ground floor of doing that is just like, you go ask somebody a question. The stories, they just emerge if you know how to do that. And then there's like a couple of things that you should know, that I could put on a piece of notebook paper. Like, well, make sure it's on the record. How do you know that? Well, because of this and this, fact check, there's an ethics to it that you should probably keep in mind. And then other than that, the form can be kind of whatever. In fact, you brought up comedy. That I think is the thing that has made me the most interested in what new forms journalism will take. Because certainly the stuff that has done really well in the States has been, Daily Show, Last Week Tonight. And a lot of people have said since the Daily Show started, however long ago that was, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, a lot of younger people are like, that's where I get my news. And you could say, well, is that bad that you're getting your news off of a satire? It's like, well, if you know how to navigate it, does it matter that they made a joke at the end of that line of information? No. People know how to navigate that. They know how to interpret it.
Yeah. People might be misinformed, but I do not think that the people are stupid. definitely miseducated and
Yeah.
not taught properly, but they're not dumb. Definitely not dumb. So I definitely agree with you with the comedy because comedy definitely seems to be taking over as a main form of people getting information out. And it's kind of because they got the leeway because they've had Lenny Bruce in the past who's pushed the limits of what could be said, or George Carlin who's literally taken words to the extreme to the utmost point. So
Yeah.
now comedy kind of can get away with telling the news. And South Park, I love South Park for this. South Park is brilliant at telling you news. That was one of the main resources I had for growing up when I was a teenager getting news because they would come out and they would just rip on both sides. They didn't care about which side they were taking. They would just say both sides, you know, giant douche and turd sandwich. Like that's what the election process is. They don't care. Both sides are horrible,
Right.
and that's a great way of doing it. And a lot of comedians are doing it now, where they're just coming out and telling news. Jimmy Dore, which I didn't think I'd ever be going to him for news, but sometimes he has a lot of good stuff that he's put out. And that dude he's just a comedian. He should not be. I don't know if he shouldn't be doing it, but it's weird that the comedians are doing it in a sense because it really should be the New York Times. It really should be WOPO
Yeah.
kind of pushing all the stories.
Mm-hmm.
But it is a title shift, and this could be a good thing. This could be a good thing. I don't know where it's going to end up, but
Yeah.
yeah, it's moving in a good direction, I think.
I think so. I mean, I ultimately, and I've spent my entire career mostly working for alt weeklies. And when I came in 20 years ago, they were just beginning their decline. The internet was enough of a thing. The commercial internet, had started in 1996, and then I started working for pubs, in the early 2000s. And certainly there was a lot of news to write about because we had gotten in one and then two wars. And so there was a lot going on. But even then, the alt weeklies were already starting to feel the pinch as more and more money went to the internet. So the idea that like our days were numbered, again, is something that we just sort of lived comfortably with. And two, you could feel the kind of the fossilization of so many of these kind of cultural norms. Like we were saying earlier, do people not read newspapers because something about the content is offensive? Maybe, but it also could just be that it is an unnatural part of a modern person's behavioral patterns. And so like the whole idea of like a headline and a subhead and like the inverted pyramid style, which is like the important information up front, up top, and then it becomes less important as you go through all of that stuff, which has been with us for 150 years. All that stuff's dying away. And I think partly it's like, well, that's just what needs to happen. And what comes out of it next, I think we're seeing, the leading edge of that is going to be stuff that's more inflected by comedy and, that has an eye toward like, we want people to listen to us. So we're going to work hard to get your attention. And then, so we have to be entertaining. But then once I've got your attention, I also better have something to say because you're going to run out of stuff to say fairly quickly. And then you can become super partisan and become, like a Tucker Carlson kind of a person where it's like, I'm going to build my informational direction from these sort of partisan ideas and from ideas that I want to push forward, as opposed to, quote unquote, pure journalism, which is something's going on. I'm going to go figure out what it is. And then I'm going to try and tell that story in an entertaining way. And again, I think there's still a huge appetite for that. And I think it's a relief when people, kind of like with South Park, like you can trust that because you're like, I think they hate everybody. And I think that's good. They should, they should be outside of the conventions. If you feel like you're benefiting, if MSNBC is benefiting from a lot of wealthy liberal viewers, or if Fox is benefiting from wealthy Republicans or mainstream or whatever, then you're gonna tailor your content to that. It's obvious. So you feel like, well, those are just insiders. They're just also part of the thing. And also I think it's important to point out, like, I may be critical, like a lot of angry journalists are critical of like the way New York Times has covered this, that, and the other thing. And of course, it's not a monolith. I mean, I think you can enumerate their mistakes, but I mean, like their arts coverage is good in a lot of ways, and their science coverage tends to be great. Like there are these pockets where it's like at the end of the day, there are individual journalists who are doing really good work, and they're being left alone enough, or they have understanding editors, or there's just not enough cultural pressure that's forcing those conversations into some sort of conformity that we can see from outside and go, ugh, that's so compromised. Like there's still really good stuff in there, which is why I continue to read the New York Times and all the rest, in part to learn about the world, and also to be able to understand what are the biases that are continuing to shape these decisions. And then you read other stuff, of course, to balance that out. It's a lot of work. You got to be real. Unfortunately, I think, if you think about the hypothetical farmer or small town person anywhere, it's like, do you really need a bunch of different sources of information for this thing that's really important to you? I mean, ideally you have more than one, but I mean, even one would be good to know, you know, about the dams that were built by the Chinese to take Australian water. Like, all you need is one to start, and then you can hash out what that means later.
Yeah, it just takes the one to do it. I don't know if they will though, because I have a sneaking suspicion that a lot of their funding is coming from them. So I doubt very much they'll ever be permitted to talk about it.
Yeah.
There was I only saw one other coverage of it, and it was completely biased towards the other side. And they had all these not to go down this story too much because there's plenty of other stuff to talk about, but they had all these fish just turning up dead, like thousands and thousands and thousands of fish just dead, washed up because the water had gone, and the water's also getting so polluted because there's less water now, but there's more runoff from the farms. So the runoff has remained the same with all the chemicals and shit. So the water's coming in, and usually it distills it, and the fish can survive off how much pollution there is. But now there's less water and the same amount of runoff. So now all these fish are just dying because they can't survive in it. And they sent reporters down to cover it, and it was just complete nonsense story. And they just ran this story about how disgusting the fish were. Nothing to do with the water, nothing to do why with all these fish are dead, just how disgusting the fish were and how they weren't good eating fish and all this stuff, and had zero to do with what the cause was, zero to do with the actual story. Just about they started talking about these fish. It was pretty disgusting.
Yeah. So is that something that you would be interested in going down yourself to cover and talk about?
Our borders are shut at the moment, so we can't travel interstate right now. Maybe when they free up, I'll see. I mean, yeah, could be something, but a lot would have to change because the borders until August next year. It looks like they're going to be shut, so not really much travel going on in Australia at the moment.
And that's within from state to state?
Yeah. So in between the states, we can't travel.
Hmm.
You got to have exemptions.
Right.
One of my friends put in an exemption 10 weeks ago, and she just heard back yesterday. I think it was Monday. No, it was Monday. She heard back. So 10 weeks just to get a letter to say you can travel interstate, and that's only once. If you want to travel back, you have to reapply. So,
And if you wanted to leave the country, that's up to the country that you're going. Or it'd be like, well, if you want to get back, you're going to have to jump through some hoops.
it depends. If you want to, it it's very sketchy at the moment. You're pretty much not allowed to leave. There are some people who have had to give up. There's stories I've heard of people giving up their citizenship just so they can travel to another country at the moment.
Whoa.
Which seems a bit extreme for me to want to do that. I don't really want to give up my citizenship. I like it here for all its flaws. I very much like it here. So,
Sure.
yeah.
It's a wonderful place.
Apparently, in August next year, the restrictions will be removed. So we can hold out till then. Um, if they stay in place after that, then I might kind of reconsider because that's too extreme for me. That's kind of pushing the line. It seems like a bit of an overreaction at that point if they extend it. So hopefully it goes back to normal at that point. If the borders did open up, yeah, I would love to go around the country and interview people from all over the country and talk about what's going on. Very much so. That'd be amazing.
And restaurants and things like that, you can go in. Those are open.
Yeah, restaurants up here in Queensland, we don't really have any restrictions as such. It's only the borders, so going in between. So we had a 10-day lockdown at the beginning. We had two 10-day lockdowns, like 6 months apart. And during that time, we were encouraged to stay home. But no one really listened. Everyone just kept going out because we've had, I think in Queensland, we've had 6 cases, 6 deaths in total. So no one really, no one really worries about it up here. We're kind of, yeah, it's not really a major concern here in Queensland. Everyone goes out to the pub, everyone still goes and lives their life as normal. They tried shutting down national parks, which was very strange because
Hmm.
you're getting sunlight, you're getting exercise, you're staying healthy. So that was kind of a thing that when they announced that, I knew a lot of people. I won't say names, but I knew a lot of people that were like, I'm deliberately going out now because you said I can't. So
Right.
that was weird. But the pubs, shops, everything like that, they encourage masks, so you had to wear masks when you went in the shops.
Mm-hmm.
But that was pretty much the extent of it here. Queenslanders don't really. We're more the leave us alone, we'll look after ourselves kind of mentality. But when the rest of Australia is saying we're shutting down the borders, then we play the game, we go along with it. We kind of leave us alone and we'll be okay. That kind of mentality, I guess. Yeah.
August is a long time. I feel like nerves might get a little frayed between now and then.
Yeah, if it gets worse, in Melbourne, it's definitely getting worse. Their premier, Dan Andrews, he's putting a bill forward this Friday to the Senate or the Parliament here, and that bill is going to say people who don't get the injections because of him, they will face 2 years in jail and a $90,000 fine. So I don't know what it's it's pretty insane. I don't know what it's like there in America, but if you got a criminal history here, it's very difficult to get a job when you get out. It's, as soon as they see criminal history on there, you're not getting a job anywhere. So to get out of jail after 2 years, which is absurd, and then have a $90,000 fine, there's no one in Australia that has $90,000 lying around to spend on that. It's a ridiculous amount of money. And then not having a job once you get out, and then having to pay that 90 grand off, it's going to put people in. It's going to create debt slaves for the rest of their lives. Um, so I think Melbourne this Friday or this weekend, there's going to be a lot of if the bill gets passed, there's going to be a lot of upset and a lot of people out on the streets. I have a feeling. This past weekend, they just had 40,000 people out on the streets, which is one of the biggest protests that's ever happened because of this bill. And you had all these. The news tried to portray it as like all these anti-vaxxers were out, but you had all these vaccinated people out there saying, no, this is ridiculous. You had all these
Yeah.
people who didn't want to get the jab going out saying, this is ridiculous. You had everyone. There was Aboriginals coming in from the middle of nowhere, coming in and to the city to also protest it. You had mums and dads and cops. There was multiple cops that have retired and are now speaking about it, getting up on stage and talking in front of everyone about how absurd this is. So, and a lot of the cops that got up, they seem pretty confident that there's not going to be a single police officer that enforces that. What the penalty will be for those cops who don't enforce it, I do not know. But they seem pretty confident there would be no police officers that would actually enforce that, because it's 2 years in jail and $90,000 for not getting an injection is, I don't even have the words for how ridiculous that is. That is mental, like genuinely mental.
And that's for public servants or for anybody?
Everyone.
Ooh.
Yeah, it doesn't matter where you work. It is literally everyone. So if that's this Friday, that's going to be put forward in the Parliament. So depending how they vote on it will depend if there's riots or not. Well, not riots. We don't really riot here, but depending on how much protest there's going to be on the weekend.
And how is that being covered in the Murdoch press?
The Murdoch press, they don't really like Dan Andrews. They don't really like the Premier, so they run a lot of negative ads against him.
Mm-hmm.
So we've got the ABC. So that's our one paper that's not really touched. It is influenced now,
Right.
But it for a long time it used to be independent. It used to be the real one you could go to and get real sources. That one is covering it pretty well and saying this is ridiculous. It's very often they will take a stance on a side. Majority of the time they will publish articles that come from both sides, and they don't really take a stance. But when this came out, they were very much to the side that this is ridiculous. So seeing that, that's a pretty big stand over here. So and they had protests everywhere. So in Sydney and Perth and Brisbane last weekend, they had protests to back up the people down in Melbourne, because Yeah, it's a ridiculous rule. I don't. I would like to choose to believe that the politicians won't vote on it, but I genuinely don't know how that's going to turn out. I really hope it doesn't. I really hope it doesn't go ahead.
Yeah. I mean, I think the question of vaccine mandates is, of course, playing out everywhere, and certainly here. And you have that sort of strange bedfellows effect of quote unquote reasonable, quote unquote liberals who are for it, who are against it, and then you have, and a lot of it's for public servants like teachers, firefighters, police, and they're protesting and they're threatening walkouts. Not all of them, but some in some places. It's become a big deal. And then the idea is like, what does that mandate look like? And yeah, and how do you enforce it? And once you start thinking about, if you want something to be enforced, then you have to pass a law and there has to be a consequence. Well, is the consequence going to be minor? Well, if it's minor, then it's still going to disproportionately affect people who are lower income. So it always ends up screwing them. Rich people, they don't care, or they can pay to avoid it or whatever. But then if you have something like that is crazy, that's like it's this or your life is fucked. That's where, like you say, you're looking for words and you're like, the words that sort of come to mind start to feel, and I don't know enough about this to necessarily know one way or another, but it is, you say, well, that's a kind of social control that we have not seen the likes of in living memory in, certainly in Australia or, the United States or whatever. And so you go, okay, well, now what do we do? How do we reckon that? And, are those decisions going to play out on Facebook? And do we trust that? Oh, but also like the fact that you have a protest culture that's alive, I think is really important, where you see those things happening. And then, who covers it if things go sideways, and how it's covered. I mean, we bent ourselves over backwards trying to figure out, we in the media, trying to figure out how to cover, I'm sure you know this, how to cover the Black Lives Matter protests of last summer in 140 U.S. cities and also other places. Paris, I think they had a bunch.
I didn't realize there was that many.
There are a bunch. And, you have a bunch of people get together. Los Angeles was a perfect example of this, where you have a bunch of people who protesting peacefully. It's a very festive atmosphere. They're writing things in chalk on the street. But then you also do have people who are looting in, Beverly Hills or whatever. And the media had to decide, how do we cover this? What do we put on the front page? Do we call it a riot? Do we call it a protest? Do we show pictures of broken shop windows? If so, that means something very different, because it's like, you only have that one image. You only have that one headline. Again, the limitations of the artifact of a newspaper are like, you've really got to figure out what idea we have. And, well, if it's 95% peaceful or 98% peaceful or whatever, and then there's like a 2% outbreak of violence or lawlessness, you can't pretend that didn't happen, which is what many on the left did. But, figuring out how to balance those things and how to present those things and to sort of, again, weigh that stuff is really significant. Now we're dealing with the trial that just ended. Now it's with the jury of Kyle Rittenhouse, the 17-year-old who took a assault rifle into Kenosha, Wisconsin, and during the protest last year, and ended up killing 2 people and shooting another guy. And people are, trying to debate what that means. Was it self-defense against a bunch of rioters, or was it that he was a kid who wanted to go turn a protest into a war zone? And like, when you carry a machine gun into a place, like, these things are these conceptual issues that kind of hinge on a binary. Are you a victim? Are you a rioter? Are you a looter? Are you a patriot? Are you a terrorist? I mean, that's so wild. And and it's very easy to get wrong, in part because even if a journalist has the best of intentions, it's easy to get wrong because you don't have the space, you don't have the bandwidth, you don't have the time to parse out all of those elements. Here's what's going on this street, here's what's going on here. And so it all sort of plays out in real time on media like Twitter and Facebook. And those places are just, as we know, not ideal for like really well thought out, well reasoned ideas. I mean, they occur, and you can certainly find somebody who says something really smart about any of these issues on social media, but the way that certain things are prioritized and rewarded over others, and that get eyeballs over others, tends to mean that the conversation that the conversation that emerges is not the best quality conversation about it, as this thing again is playing out in real time. And and then journalists who live on Twitter, by the way, and base a lot of their worldview, a lot of the stories they get come from Twitter. And so, you get this overinflated sense about things' importance versus other things, and the way that you should structure a story and the sides that are involved. So all that stuff. Again, like if you don't have somebody who can go to the place, listen to the thing, to go talk to the farmer, it makes it really hard, because then what are you doing? You're relying on a bunch of people tweeting about it or sharing, forwards on Facebook or wherever.
Yeah, it's just adding to the feedback loop. It's just cycling through and through and through. Where do you kind of see Facebook direction like going? Do you see it becoming more of a feedback loop? Do you see any signs that it's trying to break that cycle, or because from what I
Yeah.
understand about Facebook, it's just trying to get as much view time as possible. Like that seems to be their one and only goal, to get as much engagement as possible. They don't really care what the engagement seems to be. It's just as long as they can get those eyeballs on the screen.
Yeah. I mean, it's a great question. I mean, it may be, along with what happens to, Google, and to a certain degree, Twitter, what happens to Facebook in the next few years, I think, is extremely important. Not just for the nature of discourse, but, um, for like the power of government to regulate companies and how much they should, you know, address speech issues. And some people will say, we want the government, the US government, to regulate what kind of content Facebook has. And Facebook's like, please do this, because we don't want to deal with it. And other people who I think are more defenders of the First Amendment will say, we shouldn't let the government do it. Um, and Facebook can be more responsible. Again, it's there are algorithms that reward certain kinds of speech and don't reward others. And the stuff that's, the most inflammatory, the most emotional, the stuff that's the most likely to be shared because of certain metrics of, it's really partisan, or it touches on these hot button issues. Um, that's all in the design of it. So it's not like Facebook is irredeemable. It's not like, well, there's just something fundamental to the platform. I mean, there is something fundamental to the platform in that it's the way they've designed the algorithms to share information. But I think you could deploy other algorithms and people would use it in the same way. And perhaps over a period of days or weeks or whatever, you'd say like, wow, the conversation has really gotten a lot better. And also we're seeing different items emerge. And, and there's a lot of theorists who are way smarter than I, who are, saying what kind of a social media platform would look ideal for the kind of conversations we need to have. Do you need something where people can write more or less or whatever? Which I guess is all preamble to your question of like what's going to happen with Facebook. And I think it really depends on, it depends on whether we think of it as a true antitrust issue. If they move to break it up, if the government moves to break it up, and then sort of what form that takes. I mean, there's a corollary with like Standard Oil in the 1920s that owned everything, and they broke it up. And it's not like, well, big oil stopped being a thing. Like it was still, it was just a bunch of companies who all had these sort of historical connections to one another, and continue to create problems. I mean, we didn't get any closer to getting away from fossil fuels. Although, if we'd gotten into nuclear in the 1920s, things might have been different. But so I think like the antitrust thing is maybe interesting. I think a lot of it is maybe a generational thing. People who are younger tend to have less patience for Facebook. In the United States, I guess I would say in the West, in the global South, there's in some places that's the internet. It's synonymous with the internet because Facebook will provide that free. I can't remember what it's called, but in India, I think maybe a couple of other places, like they'll provide free internet access, and that's what it is. So, or like on phones, I think it's on phones. And so that, that continues to be very dangerous. Um, I think they're going to continue to want to get eyeballs, right? They're going to continue to want to dominate market share. Government has to be very careful about how they regulate that, but I think probably something does need to be done. And and two, I think there's, as we talked about offline, the shift toward metaverse stuff. They rebranded because they're like, no, we're this kind of company now. We're in the universe creation business now. So, and whatever that means. I mean, because are you a fan of sci-fi? Did you read or watch a lot of sci-fi? Do you still?
Yeah.
So
I've been into the original Star Trek the past 2 years actually, which I never watched growing up, but the original is brilliant. But
which is like 2 seasons, right? There's like
I think three, yeah,
three.
seasons.
It's like, oh, there was like 30 episodes or something. No, there was more than that, but not many.
Heaps episodes.
Yeah.
Heaps episodes per season. Way more than now. It's like they were putting one out a week.
Yeah.
The whole year. But that show, I had no idea how good that show was. I thought it was just a bunch of nerds that, we're just fanboys of it, But then going back and watching it, it's like the concepts that they were dealing with were still to this day are very good concepts that still need to be talked about. But one movie which the metaverse is really making me think of is Ready Player One. It's like a one-to-one contrast, essentially, of what that thing is.
Mm-hmm.
I do not see that. I do not see Facebook with that much power being a good thing. That really stresses me out thinking about that.
Yeah. Well, so there are a couple of things there, right? Like the idea that you would have this seamless conceptual space where you can move, like Minecraft is kind of got a metaverse quality to it now, but that's not owned by Facebook. So Facebook either has to consolidate and buy up all these companies or create partnerships where you can move from. I remember that in one interview, I think with The Verge, before they announced the changeover, but when Zuckerberg was talking about the metaverse idea, he got really excited about the idea of an infinite office, which are two words that, to me, it cannot be more depressing and terrifying. Oh, you mean an office you can't leave, that we're all inside of? And like the idea that you would want to do virtual meetings because somehow that's going to be really cool. All of that stuff seems insane to me. And, the reaction to the last year and a half, almost 2 years, of having to do endless Zoom meetings and run companies, and people like being tired of that in a way that's like the human race is still recognizably human in that, like, we're sick of that. And you don't just want to, do that all the time. But yeah, the idea that's going to become a standard that we're all going to love. And that when you leave your infinite office, I guess you can't leave the infinite office because it's infinite. But within the infinite office, there is a break room that looks like Minecraft or a virtual version of a casino in Las Vegas or whatever. Like somehow that there's going to be all these spaces that coexist and you're just going to have a VR helmet all day and you're going to interact with it. I mean, it's effect. That's why I was asking about sci-fi, because I feel like if you're a student of sci-fi, all this stuff seems both weird and also really familiar. It's like, oh yeah, I read this story. I also remember that it ended badly, and that the guys who thought they were heroes were villains, and like the concept that you're now peddling was a cautionary tale. Like it was a satire. Like, in
Mirror.
Yeah. Ready Player One. What's great about that? Snow Crash, the original metaverse concept. So it was a sucky corporate space where everybody was basically an indentured servant to this mega corporation. So I think that idea. I was talking to a fellow by the name of Kurt Anderson who used to, in the 80s and 90s, he ran a magazine called Spy, which was like a satirical New York-based journalism artery. It was, sort of like a magazine version of The Daily Show. And then he did that with Graydon Carter, and Graydon Carter went on, is now the editor of Vanity Fair. But anyway, Kurt Anderson, great writer, very funny, great reporter, and had done this for years. And for example, they were in New York and they were reporting on Trump in the late 80s, and like the term short-fingered vulgarian that comes from Spy magazine. They were making fun of him, and they had articles in, the early 90s about like what president, like he was going to be president, and isn't that funny, ha ha ha. And then of course it happened. And so I was talking to Kurt about this, because there was a series of moments in his career where he would say something as a joke and then it would happen. And I never really thought about that, but some of the stuff that like you think of as satire ends up being predictive in a way that really makes you the butt of the joke. You, the creator of the satire, end up being the one saying, I mean, I said this was going to happen, but it was like not supposed to happen, and then it did. And now it's awful. So, a good satirist ends up really just being the sort of the true predictor of what will come. And rather than warning everyone away from that, you're actually sort of drawing them toward it. And I think sci-fi is doing that same thing with Elon Musk, Zuckerberg, Bezos, like, those guys. And if you look around, there's a flurry of journalism that's on that topic exactly. There was Jill Lepore did a piece in the New York Times about how Musk is sort of infected with these sci-fi ideas of yore. And anyway, there's a couple of things where people are sort of picking up on this idea of like misreadings of sci-fi by billionaires, and why that's kind of insane. Like, you're taking the wrong lesson from it, but I don't know why you're doing that. Anyway,
There was another comedian, Tim Dillon, who was talking about how Bill Gates had this plan to solve climate change, and he would essentially spray all of this dirt and just completely darken the entire sky. And he didn't have an issue with it, just completely blacking out the entire sky. And it wasn't until other people came to him and said, this is a horrible idea. You need to stop this. It didn't occur to him. He just thought, I've got the money to do it, so I can just go and do it. And it took everyone else around him to be like, this is a horrible idea. And what scares me about those billionaires is because there's so much money. It's an unimaginable amount of money. Like, you can literally buy countries for the amount of money for those guys.
Yeah.
And if they don't have those people around them, if they're just surrounded by yes men, then society is going to go in a bad place.
Mm-hmm.
As you were saying before, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. It's like you think you're doing the right thing, but everyone thinks they're doing the right things. You got to actually take a step back yourself and actually analyze what you're doing.
Yeah.
I don't know if these guys are doing that. And I don't think it's their fault. I don't think they're deliberately trying to be bad guys. I do think that they are thinking that they are doing the right thing. But unless you've got that check in place to make sure that what you are doing is right and it's having less negative effects and it's having more positive effects, then it's going to keep happening, which it does seem to be heading in that direction.
Yeah.
Elon Musk Neuralink, I don't know if you know much about Neuralink, but that thing is horrifying. And if that was Bill Gates or someone else putting that forward, that would be like, on every paper would be talking about how horrible an idea that is. But because it's Elon Musk and he's got such a fan base, it's like, oh yeah, cool. It's just Elon being eccentric. He's just doing his own thing, just putting microchips in brains. Like, and human trials start next year. Next year,
yeah,
we're gonna have the first human trials. That is mental. That is mental. If you went back 10 years, there is no way you'd be able to convince anybody that that's going to happen in the 20s. There's no way. There's no way that discussion will take place. And yet here we are next year, and it's about to enter human trials. At the same time, he's planning to fly rockets to Mars.
Yeah.
So, and he makes a good point for Neuralink. Don't get me wrong. Like, you're solving the bandwidth issue of you not being able to read enough information, or you can only watch YouTube videos at maximum or at time to speed. You can only retrieve so much data at once. But with this, it would open up that bandwidth, and you would be able to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I do see the benefits for it, and helping people that can't walk again because they can control their legs and stuff like that. That's obviously how they're going to push it first, but eventually it will get to a point where it's like, oh, I can read all of the internet in 10 seconds. That's going to be a major selling point.
I think that's what's so interesting about the time we're in, just as a human being, certainly as a journalist. Like, when I have talked to journalist friends who are by and large human beings, about the last year, and they're all like really stressed out and depressed, and unsure about the way things are going to be, as again everybody is and was. Um, but it's also like, but this is our best time to be journalists. Like, there's stuff to write about, there's stuff to think about and talk about. These are you're feeling these significant uh, pivot points for human civilization. If we do this thing, the next 100 years may play out very differently, and we may be at one of those pivots. Or it always feels like that throughout human history, like this is always the end of history and the next thing's around the corner. But there is that sense, right? Like, we got rockets, like civilians. Shatner went into space a minute ago, and now next year there's going to be, the Neuralink chips are going to be in people's heads. All of a sudden, it's upon us when we've been talking about it, thinking about it for decades. All of a sudden, like, it seems like in the course of 6 days, everything is hurtling forward. And I think what's so peculiar, and I imagine it maybe is a function of age, once you've like seen enough cycles of culture go through, maybe it's just that what it feels like. But it also does feel like we're on one side of something, and on the other side of that could be like our total destruction. Or in 20 years there are people with that are like reading the entirety of the internet in 5 minutes, and they're like, well, what were you worried about? And there will be consequences, just like there are consequences of reading Twitter now. But like, if you told that to somebody in the 50s, they'd be like, what you're saying sounds insane. Like, you have a supercomputer in your pocket and you look at all of these things that all these people are saying, and you're still saying, it's like, well, no, we're not doing great, but we're probably doing better than you might have thought we were doing. So the question is, like, when we're on this side of it, yeah, how do we even know how to choose? Like, there's really is this, like, there's the conservative response to say, no, of course we shouldn't, fast track people's connection to the internet. But on the other hand, it would be nice for people who can't walk to walk if they want to. But yeah, just that tension of not knowing the way forward. I guess that's really what I'm saying. It's something very banal. It's like, we don't know what happens next. But for that really significant stuff, knowing that, you know, people could look back in the future on this moment and sort of be like, oh, they were so simple. They really just didn't know how great things were going to be because they couldn't see. But, I guess it is. It's like, well, everything sort of has a lot of possibility to be super great, but also a lot of possibilities to be bad. I mean, Facebook connected the world, and all of the bad things that came with that. And if it was designed a certain different way, or if it becomes redesigned to be a different way, then maybe it'll do better. But, again, there's no like all positive or all negative. So to sort of continue to harp on journalism, part of the problem of journalism is when things become those Manichean binaries. This is all good, or this is all bad. I mean, that's so much of what any kind of conversation is now. It's like, well, we know everything about it. I mean, there's just this nauseating overconfidence that exists with the pundit class, which is not only the people who are, at the major networks, but also like just people that have, 25,000 followers on Twitter who must now have a hot take. But it's like, you're not going to know. You don't know what the Black Lives Matter protests are going to mean in the grand scheme of things. Like, are they going to create racial justice? Well, maybe in 10 years it'll look real different. And so there is that sort of sense that like these things must be decided now. And the only way to do that is to accelerate toward this kind of big conclusion. Well, it's all bad. Well, no, it's really good, But it's like, well, no, nothing is that. And that kind of nuance, I think, is really hard, and in part because I guess we're going through so much information. Like, you need what's the point? I got 24 more stories I have to read in the next hour. I need to know. I have 17 more podcasts. What's the takeaway? Do I need is this a yes or a no? If it's a maybe, I don't have time for you. Unsubscribe.
Like, I'm definitely a hypocrite in the sense, because having the chip in my head sounds very scary to me. But if I'm
Oh, I
going to
thought you were
see,
saying like, oh, I mean, I have one in my head and it hasn't bothered me so far. I was like, well, you buried the lead, Finn.
but if I'm going to see a doctor, and I'm going to see a doctor without an implant, or I can go see a doctor with an implant that's linked up to every other doctor, I can see all the other doctors and what's going on in the area, and can read all the journals going on that are being published 24/7. I'm probably going to go to that doctor with the implant, because I feel like they would know more about what's going on. So I would
Sure.
I would trust that doctor more. But at the same time, completely horrifies the hell out of me. Like that. having a chip in my head is so scary to me. It's such a sketchy idea. But I would 100% pick that doctor every time. Every time
Yeah.
I'd pick the doctor that knows more. So it's weird times. It's almost like we're doing all the bad at the same time we're doing all the good. Like both paths are
Yeah.
happening at the same time.
Yeah.
It's
I was I do a
fun, yeah.
podcast with a friend, and we were talking about the metaverse and the idea that you can sort of tease some of these ideas, like some of the big ideas of if we spend a lot of time on the metaverse, you could take whatever avatar you wanted. You could be a giant rabbit with, tank treads instead of legs and, beautiful wings. And that's just how you sit in the meetings, on Monday morning. You're just sitting there and you're sitting next to whatever, Homer Simpson or, a living mathematical equation or whatever. And that's just the form people take online. Um, and what seems kind of cool to think about is like how that just blows open the idea of identity in a way that, makes things like you know binary, non-binary, like gender issues, like all of that stuff seems like, oh, we're just in the front door of what kind of being a person can be if you're spending a lot of your time as this avatar where people don't even look like humans anymore. And the same kind of thing is true with, once we start getting into, if we become more accustomed to the idea of genetic engineering and what that means too, and all of these things we sort of are teasing now. And again, you can find all of these reasons why, using CRISPR for eradicating disease or, making people live longer. I mean, again, these are not things that are around the corner, but the appeal of those, you can sort of be like, all right, yeah. But, am I going to be the first one to get the microchip? Am I going to be the first one to get the shot? I mean, and I think it'll look the same. It'll look kind of similar. There'll be a political figure who's like, if you don't get the microchip, you're going to prison for 2 years and you got to pay $90,000. You're never
That
gonna work again if you don't have that chip in your head.
there
Shit, man,
would
I don't
definitely
know.
be rebellions if that happened. That's for sure. I think you're always going to have those people who are so involved into it, like the people waiting outside the Apple Store for the new iPhone. They're out there
Yeah.
again for a week before it comes out. You're always going to have those people in every single industry. Like those people
Mm-hmm.
always exist, always. So you have those people lining up to get the implant, and at the same time, you'll have everyone living out on the farm in the middle of nowhere who's like, "I'm never get that chip installed."
Right.
But I I think that it is inevitable. I think we will all end up getting the chip. It'll just be when we decide to get it. Like I'll probably get the chip 10, version 10 or something like that. The first three, had all the negatives and they had all the positives. But for the past, 5 generations, it's been fine and there's been no negatives.
Yeah.
And we've seen how it's interacted with everyone. And so it's like, okay, yeah, this is cool. We can control it now. It doesn't take it over.
Yeah. Well, I think there'd be a lot of baby steps, right? Like there are some biohackers who have like SIM cards installed in the webbing right here, the webbing. And so you can like wave your hand over a pay pad, you get your groceries, you wave your hand over and it pays. It, just the same way as you do with your iPhone now. So it's like, well, that's a step. It's not changing the way I think, but it's just making things a little faster. Or, you got the Ray-Ban glasses, Ray-Ban stories, where that would be a light introduction. Yeah. That's a light introduction to the metaverse or to augmented reality or whatever. It's not integrated. You can take them off and go back to the real world. But at some point, it might be like, well, it got to be a lot easier if I had contact lenses. And then there you go. And you're like, ugh, I got to take these contacts out and wash them all the time. I just want to spend all my time in the infinite office. And then they're like, well, we can give you a bionic eyeball, man. And also, if you want to think about these things faster, like, in other words, you can see all these baby steps that will get us to that point. And, maybe at some point you're like, I mean, I'm not going to transplant my whole head. The bionic head, forget it. I'll keep my head, but I will I'll put a bionic ear on or something. I'll do the chip all day. I mean, this is Finn, in 15 years.
Yeah,
Maybe.
then you reach like a philosophical point where it's like, at what point are you still Finn? At what point are you still you? How much robot parts do you have? Are you the robot or are you the original human?
Yeah.
We're entering a time which is, yeah, you're right. There's so many stories here. There's so many stories that journalists could cover because This has never even slightly happened in the past before. This is a whole new world,
Yeah.
entire new existence.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing, right? Is this a break from history in a fundamental way, like has been promised before, or like has happened, between, before we had the atomic bomb to afterward? It's like, oh, now we do have the means to wipe out the human race. Before, I mean, it could have happened slowly with, climate change or whatever, but now it's like we can do it quick. Somebody can push a button and that's the end of that. So, okay, that's a different conception of what it means to be a human. But then a lot of, like Standard Oil is maybe a corollary to Facebook. You can find like, well, big corporations that overreached, or, massive amounts of wealth that were creating a feudal state. Like you see those kind of patterns recur throughout history. And the question for us that I think is very hard is to say, is this truly a break? Is this the new thing? And, again, once we step across that threshold, does being human in the same way, I mean, does being human mean something different after that? And is there something we can point to in the past and be like, well, it's just like when when the printing press was invented in 1440, and after that, blah, 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 it's like that. Well, maybe it's not. But that's wild to think about. Yeah. And at what point do we just become like really different? I mean, when somebody lives on Mars, or when somebody lives on the moon, or when somebody's born on an asteroid, you can say that is different. That has not happened before. It's not like a different.
Be a Martian if they were born on Mars.
They would be a Martian. Yeah. You'd be you'd be a Martian. Yeah. The human Martian. But that'd be different. You'd say that's measurably different. And then in the meantime is like, we kind of wrestle with the questions of, is Facebook doing the same thing that the newspapers of yore were doing? A little bit yes, a little bit no. So it's not a total break from, the past. Anyway, I think about those things as interesting, because it does seem like so many things are just iterations on a theme, a little bit of a change, a little bit of a change, a little bit of a change. And then some stuff does feel like maybe there's a break and everything's different. But you never know until you're like on the other side and you're like, oh, we can't go back. We're committed to this now.
Hindsight is 2020.
Yeah.
I think that's a pretty good spot to end it. Leave the people wondering about it.
Yeah. Something to trouble your dreams. Like that.
Point your dreams, everyone. All right. Well, thanks for coming on, man. It was a great talk.
Yeah, it was great I'm glad we finally figured this out and figured out for all of our sophistication as human beings, we couldn't quite figure out our time zones, but we did. And I think we've done very well for ourselves. Thank you. Anyway, so yeah, thank you for having me on. Let's do it again if you want.
Yeah, definitely. Oh, for sure, man. I'd love to have you back on. Maybe in 6 months' time when the metaverse is out there. Actually, maybe after the first human implants.
There we go.
That'd be good. That'd be a good story. Alrighty, man. We'll catch you later.
All right, take care. Thanks.